After reunifying the once shattered Russia, the government of Vasily Shukshin would work tirelessly to reclaim the motherland status as a great power. Although the Russian Federation was by no means a minor actor, she did not have the ability to project power beyond her borders. She lacked the influence to sway foreign governments both near and far, for this required Russia to expand her political and economic power over her neighbors. President Shukshin and his cabinet recognized this. The Foreign Ministry drew up plans for a political restructuring of Central Asia through the establishment of a Russian-led regional organization. The result was the creation of a political and military alliance known as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO. It was hoped that the sovereign governments of Kazakhstan and Turkestan would willingly participate in the organization, but after receiving invites to the Russian capital, the two countries' leaders refused to cooperate. In Kazakhstan, the refusal to integrate into the CSTO system was born out of a newfound confidence of their own self-reliance. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan had continued to operate their own socialist government. When Russia plunged into chaos during the Smuta, Kazakh socialism thrived without Russia, and so the offer by a bourgeois government in Russia was completely rejected on the grounds of protecting proletarian rule as well as Kazakh sovereignty from a Russian takeover. These concerns were not unfounded. Many in the Russian business community salivated at the potential profits of acquiring Kazakhstan's mineral deposits, as it would allow them to dominate the regional rare earth metal trade. The economic interests of the business community neatly aligned with the political designs of the Russian government, who desired political hegemony over Central Asia. Members of Shukshin's cabinet considered Central Asia to be a crucial component of Russia's sphere of influence, and that without control over the steppes, Russia would cease to be a major power. Central Asia's refusal to take part in the CSTO would lead towards a Russian military intervention in Kazakhstan and Turkestan. In May 1974, border skirmishes between small units of the Russian and the Kazakh armies occurred. The incidents at the border killed a dozen soldiers on each side. Kazakh Premier Zumabek Tashenev quickly denounced the attacks, calling it an act of Russian aggression against Kazakh socialism. President Shukshin responded with a denouncement of his own towards the Kazakh premier, citing Kazakhstan's refusal to partake in the CSTO as a threat to collective security. In response to the increasing tensions, both sides mobilized as war became inevitable. On June 18, 1974, the Russian Federation declared war on Kazakhstan. The declaration of war was followed by the initiation of Operation Perovsky, Russia's planned military operation for the invasion of Kazakhstan. Approved by the All-Russian Chief of Staff, the operation organized a combined force of 600,000 ground forces and 400 jet fighters to overwhelm Kazakh defenses. Russia's motorized divisions led the assault into the steppes, meeting face-to-face with the Kazakh Red Army in open battle. In West Kazakhstan, the Russian army led by Vladimir Abramov attacked enemy positions in Oral and Aktobe, overwhelming their defenses with a mobile assault. The encircled Kazakh Western Army fought to the bitter end, inflicting heavy artillery fire on surrounding Russian units. However, time was not on their side. The Kazakh artillery batteries would soon find themselves running out of supplies and ammunition. The main Kazakh force would not fare any better than their comrades in the west. Pavlodar and Oskeman, key supply hubs for the eastern Kazakh HQ, became targets of Russian airstrikes. Following the airstrikes, Russian ground forces assaulted the eastern defense line. Overwhelming numbers pushed the Kazakh army deep into the country. 2.5 weeks into the initial invasion, the Kazakh Communist Party surrendered to the Russian Federation. The occupation of Kazakhstan deeply alarmed the despot of Ashgabat, Sari Karyev, dictator of Turkestan, who launched his own preemptive invasion of Kazakhstan. The standoff between Russia and Turkestan immediately devolved into all-out war, as Turkestan engaged unprepared Russian units out of South Kazakhstan. The routed Russian armies regrouped and initiated their own counterattacks. By early September 1974, the counterattack would turn into an invasion of Turkestan, with Russian troops occupying Samarkand, Tashkent, and Nokis. The capital of Ashgabat became subject to a brief siege, which ended with Karyev's surrender. In place of the former governments, Russia would install new regimes more receptive to the Federation's political and economic desires. The Kazakh socialist system would be dissolved, with state-owned companies sold off to the highest bidder, who more often than not were Russian businessmen. Unified under the single market of the CSTO, the national economies of Central Asia would be reoriented towards Russian interests. These developments ended decades of Central Asian economic self-sufficiency and restored the international division of labor. Once more, Central Asia would become a source for foreign resource extraction. With Central Asia resubjugated in 1974, President Shukshin reoriented his diplomatic efforts towards the Far East in Manchurian-controlled Vladivostok. The Russian-populated region had resisted Manchurian rule since its occupation, lightly resisting the Quantum Army from time to time. The reunification of Russia in 1972 reignited the flames of these insurgent groups, who received small aid from the Russian government. By 1974, the insurgency had drained a sizable amount of Manchuria's annual budget. Wishing to resolve the conflict, Manchuria utilized diplomatic back-channels between Russia and Japan to initiate peace talks. The Beijing peace negotiations began on November 7, 1974, lasting 6 months and resulting in the peaceful handover of Vladivostok to Russia. By mid-1975, the Russian Federation had tied up its loose ends in Central Asia and the Far East. The Central Asian Wars, the Beijing peace negotiations, and a brief war with Finland had effectively restored Russia's place on the world stage. Now, with her markets secured, the military tested, and her diplomatic prestige restored, Russia turned her attention once more to the enemy in the West, the eagle in Germania. Germania's situation in the 1970s had essentially recovered from the calamities of the past decade. Under the helm of Führer Martin Bormann, a political restructuring of the NSDAP occurred to prevent another civil war upon the Führer's inevitable death. This political restructuring of the party coincided with the entrenchment of German economic dominance over Eastern Europe to the detriment of the indigenous people. The Eastern European populations were made to endure decades of human trafficking, violent displacement, and forced land acquisition from their German oppressors. The legacy of General Plan Ost that had prevailed since the end of the Second World War and was challenged during the 1960s had continued well into the 1970s under Führer Bormann. And even when the Führer died of cancer on the 13th of August 1973, the government of his successor, Kurt Waldheim, would do little to challenge the status quo. The end of the Third Reich's colonial project would only come from outside pressures, particularly from a revanchist Russian Federation. With an agreement reached between Japan and Russia in 1974, Shukshin felt confident in confronting the German Reich head-on in an armed conflict. He had no delusions that a peaceful settlement could be made with Germania regarding the occupied lands of Eastern Europe. In an effort to elicit public support for a future war, Shukshin's government subtly encouraged the Russian press to publish stories of German atrocities in the Muscovite RC. The more hawkish and nationalistic-minded newspapers called on Shukshin's government to wage a patriotic war against Germania. The patriotic frenzy in the summer of 1975 did not confine itself among fringe right-wing groups. Soon, leftist and socialist newspapers sounded the alarms for a people's war against fascism. With the home front secured, the all-Russian army began preparations for their military campaign against Germania. The Federation capital of Novosibirsk became the center of Russian military planning, where decisions on strategy and logistics were made. By the end of the meetings, President Shukshin would sign a draft of the military operation named Operation Suvorov, the Russian invasion of the Greater German Reich. All that was left was for a political crisis to occur that would ignite a war between Russia and Germany. This was difficult, because such an outcome would only happen if Germania overreacted to increasing escalations. The unlikeliness of this was due to Kurt Waldheim's government having shown itself to be passive in foreign policy. His government rarely took actions that rocked the fragile international order, preferring diplomatic conferences over saber-rattling, owing to his background as a seasoned diplomat. This commitment to diplomacy should not be mistaken for pacifism, however, as the Führer continually justified Germany's occupation of Eastern Europe. To bait the Germans into a war, Shukshin would have to corner the Führer into one he could not back down from. The Russian president would approve the funneling of small arms through the border with Germany, which fell into the hands of anti-German partisans. Now well equipped, the partisan organizations began acting bolder against German authority. The partisans, who were once used to attacking police stations, military checkpoints, and governor offices, now targeted German-owned farmlands and estates. The entirety of German colonial society became valid targets for the partisans, who used any means to dissuade their oppressors. News of the unrest in Muscovite RC would find its way to the streets of Germany. NSDAP mouthpieces published exaggerated stories of partisan violence against German settlers. Angered by government inaction, spontaneous protests popped up all across Germany. They called for action against Russia, who they blamed for the recent unrest. Führer Waldheim's strongly worded denouncements did little to satisfy the patriotic mobs, who demanded an all-out war. Soon, mobs of patriotic Germans were signing up for paramilitary organizations that promised retaliation against the partisans. When these undisciplined Prussian mobs arrived in the east, they contributed to a major escalation in the conflict. Rowdy and disordered, some of these German militiamen found themselves wandering into Russian territory. The resulting skirmish ended in a bloodbath for the German paramilitaries, who were outgunned by the well-equipped Russian army. President Shukshin would catch wind of the incident, who used it as a pretext to occupy German military outposts in Saransk. Caught off guard by how fast tensions had escalated, Führer Waldheim ordered a mobilization of the German army to the east. He believed such a posturing would frighten the Russian army into a retreat, but he was mistaken. President Shukshin had hoped for a German mobilization. With his pretext secured, war was now all but inevitable. On August 15, 1975, the world stood in silence as Russia declared war on the Greater German Reich. In a televised address to the nation, Federation President Vasily Shukshin announced his intention to liberate West Russia and Eastern Europe from German occupation. The declaration of war was followed by Russian military incursions into Muscovite RC territory. MiG-27 airstrikes led the assault, leveling German military defenses in the border regions and paving the way for Russian armored and mechanized columns. In the early stages of the war, the Wehrmacht's hastily mobilized forces would struggle to hold off the well-organized Russian army, who captured important train junctions, military outposts, and air bases in Muskovian. Meanwhile, Russian armor began running through border fences, used by the Germans to segregate the Russian population in an open-air prison. The first 11 days of the war were an unmitigated disaster for Germania. According to estimates, the German army would sustain 249,000 casualties. In comparison, Russian casualties numbered around 72,000. Furthermore, the German army would lose control over several border towns, including Kuznetsk and Saransk. In the north, strings of German fortifications would fall to Nestor Kozin's 12th Army, opening the road to St. Petersburg's liberation. With the initial successes of the Russian offensive, heavy emphasis would shift southwards as the Russian army aimed towards the industrial city of Paulusburg. Considered as Muscovite RC's second administrative capital, the city was the railroad hub of the south and connected the RC to the oil-rich Caucasus territories. The capture of such a strategic zone would be a major blow to the German war effort, and so, the 3rd Russian Army Group penetrated deep into the open plains of Penza, Saratov, and Pokrov. This assault was supported by a total redeployment of the Russian Air Force in an effort to secure total air supremacy in the south. By September 20th, 1975, the cities of Pokrovsk and Ivanovo would fall to the Russian army. 1 month into the war, and it seemed like Germany had faced setback after setback. These defeats were partly a result of Germany's late military mobilization, but as more and more German troops arrived at the front lines, the battle for Moscovian would quickly turn into a meat grinder. Soon, the Russian motorized infantry faced off German mechanized troops. These troops were trained and better equipped than the hastily deployed local forces. Nowhere was this more visibly seen than in the Battle of Paulusburg. In September 1975, it seemed the Russian army was poised to take the city. However, by November they found themselves pushed further north along the Volga. This occurred all across the front line, as German defenses were reinforced throughout late 1975. Soon, both armies settled into defensive positions as the winter cold set in. The cold winter of 1975 brought an end to the initial Russian offensive. Winter brought along a whole host of strategic and logistical challenges to both armies, limiting their capacity to launch large-scale maneuvers. The snow and ice proved to be of particular annoyance to the motorized armies, as icy roads increased the risk of crashes. These weather conditions severely impacted the delivery of supplies to the armies, who relied heavily on supply trucks to replenish food and equipment. That is not to say a truce had occurred along the front lines. Far from it. Small-scale skirmishes would erupt from time to time, especially in the south where fighting had been the most brutal. By New Year's 1976, plans for a renewed offensive had been scheduled for the spring. With the winter cold fading into spring light, a large formation of the Russian 3rd Army Group would coalesce around the Volga. This renewed southern offensive had 3 goals: to break German defenses in the encircled city of Klagenfurt, and to capture Kamishin and Paulusburg. Russian High Command gave the order, and soon Russian troops were back on the offensive. The encircled German army in Klagenfurt would surrender after intense combat on the 21st of April, giving the Russian army the necessary supply lines to advance towards Kamishin. To keep up with the initiative, the Federation's motorized infantry swept into the Don Basin, pushing German troops out. By June 3rd, Kamishin too would fall to the Russian army, paving the way towards capturing Paulusburg. The siege of Paulusburg began with an aerial bombardment of strategic fortifications by Russian bombers. Soon, the motorized brigades and engineering corps began fighting their way into the city, but the urban landscape of the city had made it difficult for the attackers to make quick progress. Sniper and machine gun positions constantly threatened the Russian infantry from above, while rockets made quick work of any armored assault. The encirclement of the city by mobile Russian troops 1 month later did little to crack the morale of the defenders. To capture the capital of the south, the Russian army would have to commit to a complete annihilation of the defending German army. Undeterred by their inability to capture Paulusburg in swift order, the Russian army redirected their mobile forces towards Astrakhan. The offensive faced little resistance from the badly beaten and undersupplied forces of the German South Army. By late September, the city would fall to the Russian army. Astrakhan's fall finally gave Russia direct access to the Caspian Sea. Of particular importance to the war effort, the city would be used to resupply Russian military operations in the Caucasus. Meanwhile, in the north, the campaign of late 1976 would see the capture of Yaroslavl by the Russian army as they inched ever closer to Moscow. By January 1977, fighting would shift once more to the north in Ivanovo. Unlike the mobile combat in the southern steppes, the forested northern front had evolved into trench warfare, with both sides digging into defensive positions. The Russian Chief of Staff was determined to break this deadlock and ordered the Russian Second Army Group to probe German defenses. Several gaps in the German trench lines were discovered, and orders were soon made to launch an all-out assault on Ivanovo province. The Russian army fought ferociously against the entrenched German defenses. For each trench line the Russians captured, thousands of soldiers would die on both sides. Trench warfare would mean that for each successful battle, only a kilometer of land would be captured. The intricate German trenches also proved itself a difficult obstacle for the Russian army. The first few months of the battle proved indecisive for both sides, but by April, cracks were beginning to show in the German defenses. Within 6 months, the static German trench lines were overrun by soldiers of the Russian Federation. To avoid an encirclement of their forces, the German army pulled out of Ivanovo province. In quick and orderly fashion, the Reich's forces repositioned their force around Moscow. As a result, the Russian army was unable to deliver a knockout blow to the German center. In mid-July, with major operations slowing down in the north, the Russian army prepared for yet another southern campaign. The Russian forces in the south crossed the Don River in a daring operation. By the end of the year, the Don Basin, alongside Kalmykia, had been liberated. The Russians were now at the doorsteps of the Ukrainian and Caucasian RCs. In 1978, Germany launched their first large-scale military offensive against Russia. Heavy concentrations of the German army pushed towards the Volga. The Russian defenses could not withstand the heavy attack and were pushed back from their positions. 6 months into the operation, the German army managed to capture Kargopol after a devastating battle with the Russian army. Soon, the Reich's forces were nearing the port city of Arkhangelsk. Hoping to capitalize on their successes in the north, the Germans launched an amphibious assault on the city of Murmansk. However, Russian High Command had realized the fragility of the north and reinforced their defenses. But German successes in the north did little to turn the tide in the south. The Russian southern offensive continued well into the summer of 1978. The successful campaign would cut Germany from its large oil refineries in the Caucasus. By August, the Russian army pushed the Germans back to the Caucasus Mountains. Despite facing stubborn resistance from a determined German army, the Russian forces would make quick progress in the region. By November, German forces in the Caucasus would completely surrender to the Russian army. By late 1978, the Battle of the Caucasus would end in a Russian victory. The war would reach yet another stalemate in the first half of 1979. After successfully liberating large swaths of territory from the Greater German Reich, Russia funneled more resources towards re-establishing a semblance of order in the regions. Formerly German and collaborationist-owned estates were redistributed amongst the liberated peoples. The temporary stalemate would end by June 1979, as the Russian army prepared for their counterattack against Germany's northern gains. The battle in the north would be the most brutal of the war, with both armies sending their best formations against each other. Modern battle tanks, attack helicopters, and advanced rocket systems were deployed in the battle, but the tide of the battle would be on the side of the Russians. By November 1979, the Germans would lose their advances in the north, including the Murmansk occupation zone. Soon, the Russian army pushed further into Holmgard and Tver, threatening Moscow's northern flank. The situation was beginning to unravel for Germania. The Russian offensive continued well into early 1980. After securing the northern flanks, the Russian army positioned itself to capture the occupied former capital. The Federation's troops inched ever closer to the city, until finally the spires of St. Basil's Cathedral were visible. the soldiers of the Russian army slammed hard into the German urban defenses. Slowly but surely, the Germans were driven out of the city. Moscow was finally liberated by the Russian army. Quickly, confidence in Germany's ability to win the war fell as governments around the world congratulated Russia's victory. Of particular importance was the United States' change in attitude towards the West Russia War. Where once the United States viewed the conflict with cynical pessimism, partly because of Russia's former status as a fallen power, now they saw a realistic chance at a Russian victory. Upon liberating Moscow, the Russian army would pivot once more to the north to besiege St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg endured 3 months of unrelenting urban warfare, with soldiers and tanks engaged in street-to-street combat. However, by August 1980, the German garrison began to break against continuous Russian attacks. Soon, the garrison would surrender to the advancing Russian army. The fall of St. Petersburg cemented the death of the Moscovian RC, as well as the end of Germany's occupation of Russia. Yet, the government in Germania refused repeated international calls for a ceasefire. Soon, Russian high command began drafting plans for an invasion of the Ukrainian RC and the Baltics. On October 1st, 1980, Russia began military operations in Ukraine. Russian forces concentrated their attack on 2 positions, the Donbas region and the Crimean Peninsula. Russian forces crossed into Crimea from the North Caucasus, dislodging German positions in the peninsula. Meanwhile, in late November, the Donbas offensive captured Kherson and Zaporizhia, eventually linking up with the Crimean front. With the Black Sea cut off, the German army had no choice but to defend their positions on the right bank of the Dnieper River. While combat on the Eastern Front subsided, trouble began to brew in the west. In the former occupied Netherlands, uncontrollable popular unrest turned into violent street battles against German authorities, culminating into the Battle of Rotterdam. By the end of the year, subjects of the Greater German Reich had witnessed how fragile the new order had become. New Year's 1981 began with yet another renewed Russian offensive in southern Ukraine. Several armies were to attack Germany's defenses across the Dnieper River. However, by April, the offensive stalled against Germany's defensive line. The plans had to be redrawn. By early June, preparations for the final offensive in Ukraine were complete. Several motorized and armored divisions were deployed in Ukraine to assist with the invasion, accompanied by the Air Force. On June 6, 1981, Russian troops across the entire Ukrainian front attacked the enemy position. By mid-June, several breakthroughs were made in the northern and southern sections. The Russian breakthroughs would result in the encirclement of 2 German armies in Poltava. The encirclement of the German Third Army was nothing short of catastrophic for Germany's defensive plans. Germania now lacked the troops to organize a sufficient defense of Ukraine. In 2 months, the German army would be pushed out of Ukraine by the Russian army. Within that same time frame, the Russian army had launched a parallel offensive in the Baltics. By August 21, 1981, Germania would lose control over Ukraine and the Baltics to Shukshin's army. The Russian army halted their offensive upon reaching the administrative borders of Greater Germany. The threat of nuclear strikes had worried the cabinet in Novosibirsk. The world powers too expressed their concern over escalation. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed and representatives from the Reich and the Federation agreed to a ceasefire and a peace conference. The last days of Europe were no more. The resulting Treaty of Riga, signed on August 31, 1981, ceded West Russia, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics under Russian supervision. Immediately, celebrations erupted in the streets of Russia and Eastern Europe. Symbols of German authority were publicly smashed, and effigies of German officials were hung across the towns of Eastern Europe. Non-ethnic Germans, once segregated out of public life by the Reich's policy, were now coming out in droves in celebration of their newfound liberties. However, the extent of these newly found freedoms were immediately put to the test when it came to the socialization of German privately owned lands. Many Ukrainians, Belarusians, and even West Russians felt as though land ownership should be given to the former slaves who had worked the land. But the Russian army were given orders to protect private property. They argued its importance as part of their efforts in maintaining law and order. The truth was far more complicated, however. Shukshin's cabinet had not yet drafted their plans for a land reform in the formerly occupied lands. Some within his cabinet argued for a total sale of the land on the free market. Others argued that the impoverished peoples of Eastern Europe would not be able to afford their lands in competition to foreign buyers, arguing for an immediate socialization of land. In the end, Shukshin would hand over responsibility of resolving the land question to national representatives that made up the newly formed reconstruction authorities. While the Russian Federation busied itself in establishing a new social order in Eastern Europe, the Unity Pact began to unravel. The war had negatively impacted the economy of Germany and her satellite states in the Unity Pact. An international embargo had slowed down economic growth, while conscription and the demands of the war economy chipped at the financial reserves of the German government. The sacrifices made during the war and its humiliating results ended up amplifying critical voices within the pact. The first domino to fall was the Netherlands, who declared their independence from Germany following the Treaty of Riga. Following the Dutch example, Norwegian Prime Minister Gunnar Garbo announced his government's intention to leave the pact. Within 2 weeks of their departure, Norway would officially join the Organization of Free Nations. Meanwhile, in Hungary, a failed coup attempt by the fascist Arrow Cross movement would plunge the country into a civil war. Germany was not spared from the political instability following the Riga peace accords. The Reich experienced a huge wave of student protests, followed by a brutal campaign of suppression from state security and fascist paramilitaries. Suppression quickly devolved into street fighting as students armed themselves with guns and organized into militias of their own. From September 1st to September 26th, urban street fights would claim the lives of many students and state security alike. On the 26th of September, the Black-Red Gold Reichsbanner, colloquially known as the Willy Brandt Gang, stormed the Volkshalle in an attempted coup. Hearing of the coup attempt in advance, Führer Waldheim and his government fled south. On September 26, 1981, upon the balcony of the Volkshalle, Willy Brandt proclaimed the end of the Third Reich and the formation of a new German republic. 2 weeks after the proclamation of the republic, Brandt was shot in a politically motivated assassination by an affiliate of the NSDAP. Following the assassination, any semblance of order collapsed as various factions consolidated their power centers. 18 years after Hitler's death, Germany would once more descend into civil war. On November 30th, 1981, Germany fell into yet another civil war. The students and reformist gangs turned liberal revolutionaries coalesced around northeastern Germany with the capital of Germania under their control. In the western industrial regions, communist-aligned workers had organized into the Red Army. Together, these two armies would face off against the NSDAP loyalists. The German Republican Army began a march south to arrest the NSDAP ringleaders. Together with the Red Army, they fought ferociously against the Brown Shirts. By late December, the Brown Shirts would be overwhelmed by the combined force of the Republican and Red armies, surrendering on New Year's Eve. However, Germany's troubles did not end there. In German-occupied Poland, nationalist protests would rock the streets. The chaos in Germany forced the garrison to retreat from Poland, leading to a power vacuum. This vacuum would be filled by the Polish government in exile, who immediately promised elections in the near future. In the West, with Germany distracted, the French Republic saw an opportunity to reclaim its lost territories in Burgundy. On December 14, 1981, the French army launched a military invasion into Burgundy. The beleaguered German garrison, caught off guard by the sudden French invasion, could do little to resist. Within 1 week of the invasion, the garrison would surrender to the French. The defeat of the fascists did not end the political upheavals in Germany. The alliance between the Republicans and the radical workers would eventually collapse in dramatic fashion. The Republicans quickly showed their conservative nature when, on the initial draft of the new constitution, private property was enshrined as a fundamental right. This flew in the face of the radical workers' demands, who wished an immediate end to economic dictatorship, whether state or private actors. In an attempt to snuff the workers' movement, units of the Republican Army were ordered to arrest the radical leaders. The Red Army resisted these incursions, and soon another civil war was on the way. However, the Red Army was no match against the Republic's troops. The Republic had managed to rehabilitate members of the Wehrmacht into their cause, including whole divisions and their officers. The Red Army immediately dissolved after 5 months of heavy fighting. By July 1982, the reborn German Republic announced the first elections in the country's history since 1933. The election of 1982 was won by Walter Scheel and the Conservative Party. German bourgeois democracy had returned after decades in the grave. Suddenly, the Western Front of the Cold War had ended with the death of German fascism. Seizing the moment, the United States-led Organization of Free Nations prepared for a European-wide summit on the state of the European order. Just as the Third Reich was collapsing in Europe, in the Far East, the Japanese fascist order would face a similar existential threat to its hegemony. However, Japan's challenger would not come from the outside. Japan's main adversary would be her former ally in the Republic of China. As they say, there could only be one sun in Asia. The struggle for this dominance would be the Great Asian War.